Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for our How to Manage Vendor Issues and Challenges webinar. My name is Jessie Redmond, and I will be your host. On your screen, you should see multiple widgets that you can use, including Ask Question, Media Player, Slides, Related Content, Speaker Bio, Request Demo, and Help. If you're unfamiliar with our webinars, all the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar are icon buttons you can use to show and hide the widgets. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner of the widget. If you experience any issues or have technical questions, you can use the Help widget or submit them along with any other questions through the Ask Question widget. Don't worry, we do capture all questions throughout the session. We will be answering some during the webcast, but those that we do not have a chance to answer live, we will address with you via email. Today's live session is eligible for 1 CPE credit. If you wish to receive this credit, please remember to answer all of the polling questions that will appear on your screen during today's presentation. You will also be sent a follow-up survey link 24 hours after the live session that will need to be completed in order to receive the CPE credit. With us today, we have Hillary Dewhurst, VendMinder's Head of Third-Party Risk Education and Advocacy. She will discuss the challenges you may encounter with your vendors and walk you through possible solutions. You will see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, a link to our samples library, links to our third-party risk management lifecycle toolkit, our Managing Issues in Your Third-Party Risk Management Program, the Complete Strategy ebook, our 5 Pitfalls of Vendor Risk interactive game and quick guide, as well as a link to our library of additional resources, all within the Related Content widget. With all that being said, I'd like to hand it over to Hillary. Hillary, the floor is yours.
Well, welcome everyone to today's webinar, which is all about issue management. So we're going to really just start off by defining what an issue is, and then we're going to talk about where they can pop up in the third-party risk management lifecycle. We'll also discuss why managing these issues are so important, and we'll give you some recommended steps to take as you identify issues and may have problems. And we'll also talk about what you can do to prevent or avoid those problems from happening in the first place. And then we'll wrap up with some resolutions, tips, and tricks to solve your vendor management challenges. So let's jump in. So the first thing is really defining what an issue is. So I think most of us understand the basic definition as it's listed here by Webster's. But within third-party risk management, an issue is any unexpected result or scenario requiring further evaluation or actions to mitigate that risk. Obviously, issue management is the process of identifying and managing those issues that come up and remediating them. Now, I do want to note that it is important to distinguish the difference between a risk and an issue. So an issue is a problem that is currently present, while a risk is a potential problem that may or may not arise. Both are really important. We have to manage both types, but let's look at some examples to illustrate the difference. So in our risk column, we see that customer data could be compromised, stolen, or lost, but there's an issue if there has been a cybersecurity breach. As a risk, customer-facing vendors can impact customer satisfaction, but there's an issue if customer complaints are rising. And there's a risk that unplanned downtime can negatively impact our customers, but there's an issue if the system has had a prolonged unplanned outage. Now, of course, issues can pop up at any time and at any point during the third-party risk management lifecycle. So, whether you're finding a problem during due diligence or you're in that ongoing stage and you see performance declining, it's always important to understand that managing these issues is imperative. So let's look at some more examples of where and what types of issues might pop up along the life cycle. So when onboarding we might have a risk assessment that was completed inaccurately. Or we could find through due diligence that the vendor's controls are insufficient. We also might have a limited ability to negotiate the contract or poor testing results. Examples of issues that might occur in the ongoing stage are where we have new or evolving risk. Maybe there's been a change of key personnel or management at the vendor. Or there's operational interruptions due to failure, cyber attack, etc., or even fourth-party performance issues. We can also have plenty of issues during offboarding. So if the vendor is not meeting their contractual requirements through that termination, or they're failing to return assets or data, maybe there's extreme customer dissatisfaction through that transition period, reduced productivity, or operational interruptions. Literally, issues can pop up anytime, anywhere. So who is responsible for issue management? Well, there are multiple folks across your organization, but let's start with the vendor owner, or that person who has the day-to-day relationship with that third party or vendor. They're 100% responsible for identifying, assessing, and remediating those issues, right? They're the ones working directly with the vendor to make sure it gets done. We have the business units, which the vendor owners report into, and the management at the business unit level needs to be responsible for making sure all vendors under their remit and their vendor owners are getting remediated on time and with the right quality. We also have the third-party risk management team, who's basically responsible for tracking and logging all of these issues and making sure that appropriate reporting is going out, maybe reminding people they need to get their stuff in. But in some cases, the third-party risk management team may be inviting SMEs to come in and help consult with the vendor or the vendor owner to get to better issue resolution. Of course, management and the board of directors are ultimately responsible for the effective execution of third-party risk management across the organization. And so management needs to make sure that the vendor owners, the line of business, third-party risk management are fulfilling their responsibilities. And the board needs to make sure that management is ensuring that there are effective processes in place to address issues. If there are any material weaknesses or issues aren't being resolved, the board has the obligation to push management into correcting them. Of course, we have internal audit, who's responsible for just overseeing the whole process and making sure that all of the processes and protocols align with all the regulatory expectations, laws and rules, and best practices, and that they align with any internal policies and guidelines. So if you are wondering if issue management is really all of that big of a deal, I'm here to tell you that it is. So let's walk through 8 reasons why issue management is so important. Number 1, unmanaged issues can really harm your reputation. Remember, the public does not determine or really understand the difference between where your organization starts and stops and what the vendor is doing for you. To them, it's all the same. If there's issues with the vendor, they can damage your reputation. But they also can interrupt your operations and also affect customer satisfaction. If there's problems, say, with a critical vendor, and the services or products are not being delivered on time or as they're supposed to be, again, customers may become dissatisfied and disappointed. Number 3, our regulators expect us to manage issues. And they're very clear that we all need to have a mechanism in place and a standardized process to identify, manage, and remediate those issues. But even if you're not regulated, responding to vendor issues is the best practice, and your customers expect you to. Number 4, we want to make sure that contractual obligations are being met. So, for example, if we have a vendor who has potentially not met a contractual service level agreement, we need to track that issue and determine if there's a penalty that applies, if there's some sort of payment the vendor needs to make to us or give us a discount to make our organization whole. And in very severe cases, we might want to look at those issues as an impetus to trigger our own business continuity and even exit plans in some cases. Number 5, assisting with contract renewal. So let's say your contract's up for renewal. If you haven't properly managed and tracked issues that have come up during the life of that contract, you may be missing out on an important opportunity to renegotiate the contract, to tighten SLAs, to increase those penalties, or create some other kind of leverage to make sure that the issues do not occur, or if they do, that the penalties are more severe. Number 6, we need to make sure that the vendor has proper controls in place to protect data. So if we have vendor issues that can occur because they have underlying operational problems, that can affect the quality of information security. If those vendors lack proper controls, they often experience data protection issues. So the process for managing issues can bring to light those problems that can affect our cybersecurity and information protection and privacy. Number 7, issues that negatively impact our organization's finances can include things like, hey, they missed an SLA 2 or 3 times. Now the problem's gotten bigger and we may be facing litigation or even regulatory fines, loss of customers because we didn't manage those issues. And number 8 is when there are unmanaged issues, it causes a lot of stress for your internal stakeholders because unmanaged issues can really have a domino effect and impact more than just that vendor owner or line of business. It can be a lot bigger than that, and the longer an issue remains unresolved, the more widespread its impacts become. All right, well, one thing I want to really emphasize at this point of the presentation is that managing your issues is an essential part of managing your risk. And let's look at this. So first of all, if we don't manage the issues, they can really snowball. Something small can turn into a major problem, which can increase our risk overall, or that issue can just become unmanageable. We also need to identify and understand what the root causes of those issues are, because in many cases we might, through that process, identify new or emerging risks. We also need to keep in mind that issues are often a byproduct of insufficient risk identification and management. So the reason we're having a problem is because we didn't spot a certain risk or appropriately manage a risk prior to the issue being discovered. When we don't properly manage issues, we can have all kinds of negative impacts like audit findings, regulatory enforcement actions, litigation, etc. And anytime we have an issue involving a critical or high-risk vendor, they really should be reported to management and the board. Now, I did mention regulatory expectations a little earlier in the presentation, but I want to be really clear that it's more than expectations. In some regulations, there are specific mentions of issue management. One good example of this is the big interagency guidance that came out in June of this year. The financial regulators, the OCC, FDIC, and OCC put together this guidance. Now, even if you're not in the financial industry, it's good to know that these type of regulations usually become best practices over a course of years. So they've actually managed to state specifically issue management and issues in several places in the guidance. Now, I won't go through this in too great a detail, but just to highlight, they are talking about issue management and contract clauses under the right to remediate and audit. They're talking about operational resilience and business continuity. They're also talking about it very specifically in third-party risk management roles, especially the board of directors and management, and it also comes up again in monitoring. Now again, we didn't go through all the text on these slides, so you have the ability to download the deck and read them, but it's important to realize that issue management is specifically a regulatory expectation across many industries. Now there's quite a bit of information on the next 2 slides, so I'm going to condense it just a little bit. I do want to continue to give examples of when you might discover vendor issues. across that third-party risk management lifecycle. So during due diligence, maybe you're doing your annual due diligence review and it's come to your attention that that vendor never fixed some problems that were discovered during the previous disaster recovery test. You know, that's a really big issue, right? So we need to make sure that that issue is tracked and followed up on because it can interrupt our business. Maybe during performance monitoring, you start noticing that there's a trend of declining performance and that the contractual obligations have not been met. So we definitely need to address that issue by reviewing the contract and determine if the vendor has a penalty for not meeting that SLA. And if they do, we need to get that rebate. We need to get that payment. We need to make sure that our organization is made whole. Maybe during risk monitoring, you figure out that there's a really significant deterioration of your vendor's financial health. So we would want to document that as an issue, review with the vendor, try and understand why that is, and have some discussions, you know, internally about whether or not we might need to consider an additional vendor, move some business, or consider an exit plan. And during termination, maybe we haven't gotten back those formal certificates of destruction, or the vendor who is being terminated just doesn't have enough employees to fulfill their obligations. And whatever it is, we need to document all of those issues and review that exit plan and start to activate our contingencies. But keep in mind that issues don't follow the life cycle. You know, real things happen all the time. So let's assume that you've had a data breach. You know, we definitely need to document that issue and look at our cybersecurity plan. But even if your data was not affected, you still have to follow up with the vendor to make sure that they're remediating the issue that caused the breach in the first place. And we want to review that before we renew our contracts or award additional work, because we want to make sure that all of those issues were closed before we're extending our relationship with them. We also, if there's been a business continuity planning failure, we need to document that and review our contracts and SLAs. Maybe this was a big problem that interrupted our operations. You know, we might have to enact that penalty for missing that SLA, and depending on the severity, we might even need to test our exit plan, because if they can't get it fixed, that can be a major issue. Another thing that happens very frequently is we might see negative vendor news. So when that is going on, we need to document that issue and contact the vendor, ask them for a written response and any root cause analysis, and also what their plan is for remediating that reputational damage. It's also important to continue monitoring really closely, because if more news comes up, you're going to have to take some very specific action.
And this brings us to the first poll question of the day. You should see the poll question in the area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. As a reminder, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. This poll question is, the issue management process at my organization is well developed, with defined processes and reporting for all issue types. Limited, only the material issues are formally managed. The process is not formalized and relies on the heroic efforts of a select few individuals. It's in the planning or development stages, non-existent, or you don't know. Hillary, we have some time now to answer one of the questions from the audience.
All right, let's do it.
Our organization already has an enterprise-wide issue management process. Do we need to have a separate vendor issue management process?
You know, this is not uncommon, and it is going to depend on a few things. So first of all, I would want to make sure that the existing processes and reporting is readily available for your third-party risk management team. And what I mean by available, I mean that your team can easily add issues, updates, and any details that are relevant to vendor issues. Also, as far as the reporting, you're going to need the ability to filter and extract those third-party risk management issues to provide reports specifically as part of your risk committee, your board, or your management, and you might need them for an audit or a regulatory exam. So you want to be able to provide those details. In most cases, you'll probably be fine, but in the event that the enterprise issue management tracking and reporting is not detailed or frequent enough, you may need to replicate and have your own vendor risk management issue tracking and reporting. So one thing to think about here is if you're able to clearly identify the issues that exist within your vendor, your third-party risk management program system. So if you cannot see an issue related to a vendor within your program because it's only listed at that enterprise management level, that can be a problem because things can be easily missed. So, as you're considering this, I'd start with just identifying any gaps you might have and then work with your enterprise risk management team to see how you might fully leverage those processes without having to duplicate everything. And if you do end up having to have some redundancy, make sure everyone is clear on what that is and why that is. I hope that helps.
Thanks, everyone, for answering that poll question. Here are those results. By the way, you may have noticed reactions such as a thumbs up or heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the slides widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show the reactions. Also in the related content widget, you'll find a helpful resource to reference. It's our third-party risk management lifecycle toolkit. As we just discussed managing third-party risk management issues across the lifecycle, this is a helpful resource to learn more about the stages. With that, Hillary, back to you.
All right, let's get into the actual process of vendor issue management. Now, again, there's a lot of content on these slides. I'm not going to read everything to you, but I really want to walk you through so you get a really good baseline understanding of what's required. So the first one is we've got to develop that process. We've got to define what an issue is, and we've got to document that. We also have to have a rating scale or a system to classify, how bad is the issue, because we want to standardize how we consider issues throughout this process. We also want to make sure that we have a clearly formatted and standardized issue management log, and that our reporting is also standardized, because let's face it, we're going to have issues. We're going to have stakeholders review this information, and we don't want them to be having to look all over in multiple places to just get the information they need. We need to make sure that it's clear who can, raise an issue or document an issue, and we need to train those stakeholders and make sure they have access to the systems and the log. And we need to also consider how we escalate, who will escalate, and who's going to do the reporting. And we need to, once we've standardized this, include this in our policy and program materials as necessary. All right, now that you have your process identified, we've got to go ahead and identify those issues. We have some examples here. They could be security issues. They could be not meeting SLAs. They can be failing to disclose those material things like breaches or key management departures. But there's also, little issues like poor vendor communication, or they're being resistant to give us due diligence. We need to make sure that we kind of cover the whole gamut of which scenarios are going to be considered an issue. And that's really up to your organization. But having a really standardized approach and a tool to assist with the process is really the best way to make sure that issues are captured, that they're tracked, and they're being resolved. Now, as part of that tool, we really want to have something that can sort of gauge the severity of the issue. So we want to look at things that are pretty low level, like maybe that vendor communication. Maybe that's just something we want to watch, to the opposite end of the spectrum, which might be a security breach, which would be severe. But having a way to gauge the severity is very important. And again, it's up to your organization, but having this in place will really help you prioritize, especially if you're short-staffed or there's a lot going on at one time. You can say, right now we're going to really tackle everything that's high and severe, and then we're going to get to the rest as, we have resources to do that. Okay, well, once you've identified that issue, you have to manage it. And this may be more than just the vendor owner. It might mean involving SMEs or other folks in the organization to help review, approve, and close that remediation. We always want to make sure that as we're managing the issue that we're tracking the right data points, including the root cause of the issue, the severity, and who's responsible, and what we're doing to follow up. And we've got to track that issue until it is remediated. That means talking to the vendor on a regular basis and the vendor owner, keeping everyone informed, and hey, if we need to, escalating up the food chain. We also need to always identify who is going to approve and review that remediation, and it cannot be the vendor owner, right? And depending on how severe that issue has been, if it's not getting resolved, you might need to consider testing your exit plan. All right, so let's go through some scenarios and examples here. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that sometimes you are going to have a vendor that has more than one issue. These things tend to happen in clusters. And if you remember what I said earlier, issues can often be a sign of unmanaged risk or new and emerging risk. So let's look at vendor A. They're a high-risk vendor, and we're in year 2 of a 3-year contract. Up to this point, they've had pretty good performance, and they've been reliable. However, in this last quarter, we came up with several issues. So the first one was they failed to meet a contractual SLA. They had an unplanned outage during business hours, and they've had an uptick in customer complaints. Now, they're still within the acceptable thresholds, but we do notice that those complaints are rising. Another thing is the vendor's been really slow to kind of get back to us about these concerns. So let's go through each of these issues and keep in mind that our process is standardizing, but our approach to each issue and getting it remediated can vary. All right, what about that missed SLA? So the first thing we want to do is we want to have the vendor owner review the contract and confirm the SLAs and determine if there's any penalties that will need to be enacted. Also, you need to discuss the situation with the vendor and request a root cause analysis, remediation plan, and actions for the remediation. So why did this happen? What are you going to do about it? When is it going to take place, and who is responsible at your organization? We always need to document that discussion and share the notes with the vendor and third-party risk management. We also want to set those reminders for remediation updates before they are due. So if it's going to take a month, then you're going to follow up like every Thursday until it's completed. And then we also want to make sure that if it's a longer term, that we create, realistic but still specific intervals, because maybe not enough is going to change in a week. So we talk about it biweekly or even monthly. Third-party risk management should add that issue to the log, identify how severe the issue is, and determine who's going to review and approve the remediation. They also need to set reminders and updates and add that issue to the log and all the reporting. We also want to require the vendor owner to update the issue weekly or, again, as appropriate, depending on the length and remediation time. And then if there are contractual penalties, we also want to track them to make sure that your organization is getting that discount, getting that rebate, whatever it is. All right, so let's talk about the unplanned outage. So the steps that we're going through are essentially the same. We need to review that contract. We need to identify any impacts related to the outage and document them. That's really important in this particular issue. We also definitely want to discuss it with the vendor and get that root cause analysis and plan, all the actions, timing, and who's responsible. document that discussion, get it to third-party risk management, share those notes with the vendor, and determine if we're going to have to do some testing on the remediation, right? Because this is an operational issue. We also want to set those reminders and update the issue management log weekly or as appropriate. For third-party risk management, again, the same. We're going to add it to the log and reporting, identify the severity, and what's unique here is we want to determine whether affected stakeholders are going to need more communication about what went wrong here. We also need to establish if there's going to be remediation testing, who's going to review and approve the remediation, set all our reminders, add it to the log, and require the vendor owner to follow up. Now, when it comes to those customer complaints, this is very important because there can be long-reaching implications for declining customer satisfaction and an uptick in complaints. So, of course, we're going to start with reviewing the actual complaints. We want to look for trends and trouble spots. We're going to review the complaint resolution actions and timing because the vendor should be saying what they did to resolve each complaint. And then we're going to start discussing it with the vendor, get that root cause, remediation, etc. But with customer complaints, we might have some very unique and specific actions that need to occur as part of the remediation. So maybe we're going to do some additional training for those call center agents, or we're going to monitor some calls or review the scripts they're reading. This can be very specific, so we need to pay attention to that. Of course, we want to document everything, share the notes with the vendor and third-party risk management. And until those complaints start coming down, we're going to monitor them more frequently. So maybe you look at complaints on a biweekly basis. Maybe we take it to weekly. We're going to set all the reminders and update that issue management log. Of course, for third-party risk management, we do want to log it, identify the severity, document those specific individual actions, right? So if there's a training that must occur, enter that as a separate line item. If there is call monitoring, that's a separate line item. If there is more frequent monitoring and review, each of those steps should have a separate line item so that we can check off that they have been completed. Again, who's going to review and approve, and require the vendor owner to update that issue management. Okay, so here's that one we talked about earlier. They've just been a little slow to respond to your inquiries. Maybe this is a watch or it's a low-risk item. But we do want to start out with the vendor owner requesting a formal meeting, right? And to review all the requests that have been made and the vendor's response times. We also want to, in that meeting, restate the expectations for response times and the desired format. So if I'm calling you up and I say, hey, call me back, I expect you to call me back. Likewise, if I want something in writing, I want to see an email. We need to document these conversations, and this is really important because the documentation of all these issues is not just so your organization is aware, but keep in mind that if there's a regulatory action or even litigation, documentation can serve as very valuable evidence. So we do want to document these things. We do want to keep track of this. So we're going to monitor future inquiries and response times because we want to make sure that they got the message, right? We're going to call you back or send you that email. We're going to do it in one business day or within a few hours, whatever the expectation is. And then if the vendor's not meeting these expectations, it might be time to talk to their management to ask for resolution and consider additional measures we can take if the problem continues. So, hey, if you guys can't get a handle on this, we're not going to renew your contract, or we're going to add some contract amendments, we're going to pull business, whatever it may be. From the third-party risk management perspective, always we're going to add that issue to the list. We're going to categorize it as a watch, maybe. We're going to request that the vendor owner keep the team updated on what happens after that discussion, what happens with future inquiries. And we will determine if and when that watch item is going to actually move to an issue, like it's going to go from watch to a low-risk issue or a moderate risk, whatever. If it's necessary, add it to that log, and don't forget all the measures being taken to resolve the situation, and then always request that the vendor update the issue management weekly or when it's appropriate.
Our second poll question of the day is, does your organization require contractual service level agreements for all high-risk and critical vendors? Yes, this is a standard requirement. Most, depending on the product or service. Some are critical vendors only. No, or you're not sure. Hillary, I have another question here that we can answer.
Okay.
What are best practices for issue escalation, and how soon should you escalate an issue to management?
Okay, well, I'm going to say something right off the bat. A lot of it is going to depend on your internal business culture. You know, some folks may take it as a personal affront if you're escalating that information. But beyond that, I think one of the best things you can do is to clearly state what your issue escalation process is within your policy. And I would also clearly state something to the effect of, you know, issues that are within 14 business days of their closure date will be, you know, regarded as at risk, and they'll be included on the report. And anything that the minute it is past due, I would escalate it, because we cannot afford to go back and forth and wait for someone to kind of get with the program and fix the problem. So, you know, clearly stating those expectations and then reiterating them during things like training can really help diffuse any potential, you know, kerfuffle. Oh, you went and, you know, told my boss, that kind of thing. I think that when it comes to remediating vendor issues, the whole point is we want to nip something in the bud before it gets unmanageable. So be clear about your expectations. 14 days when something, you know, is not yet due, but no action has been taken, I'd mark that as at risk. And the first day it is past due, it gets escalated. I hope that's helpful, and good luck with that.
Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. Here are the results. I would like to quickly direct your attention back to the related content widget, where you will find our Managing Issues in Your Third-Party Risk Management Program, the Complete Strategy ebook. This is a high-level guide to understand the basic strategy of issue management in your third-party risk management program. Okay, Hillary, let's continue with the presentation.
Now, we did cover the importance of documentation, but just to reiterate that anytime something becomes a real issue, it's got to be documented. And we do this to make sure that we have that official record, which could be necessary for audits, exams, or litigation, and putting it in writing, make sure that all parties are clear on both the issue and the expectations regarding remediation. And then we want to keep that documentation before we go renew the contract to see what was going on. Was it resolved on time? If we don't document that, it's likely that it's not going to come up during the contract process, and that can be a big problem. Now, again, issue management plans should also be documented, not just issues on your log. And while I'm not going to read everything on this slide, it's really important to capture all those details, especially what happens next, right? So if your executive or somebody else should pick this up, they should be easily able to determine what the issue was, who's responsible, what is happening, the current status of that issue, and what the next steps are. Now, of course, reporting is an essential part of issue management, and we want to make sure that everybody who needs to be informed is informed at the right intervals. So your organization can basically determine the format and delivery channel, how people are going to get the reports. There's no recommended best practice on that. It's what works for your organization. You may, in some cases, have an enterprise risk management system that also captures issues outside of third-party risk, you would probably want to talk to your enterprise risk management team about how to integrate those issues, or at least have a discussion about reporting so that people aren't getting bombarded with a lot of reports and maybe reading one but not the other. We also want to make sure that anything involving critical or high-risk vendors should be presented to management and the board at least monthly. Your reports need to be easy to read and interpret. A good way to do that is to add that red, amber, green color key so that it's really easy to zero on things that are at risk, past due, severe, etc. And then make sure you are providing these reports with a regular routine so people know what to expect and when to expect them. All right, just to wrap this up, here's some recommendations. Now, again, a lot of this we've already covered, but just to reiterate. One, we need to keep a conversation document log. We need to log all communications with that vendor, whether it's a phone call, a text, an email. We need all of that documentation. We need to determine the action plan, and we want the vendor to be involved with this. If we are telling them how to fix the problem, chances are it's not going to get fixed effectively. It's their issue. Give them the space and the responsibility to fix it. Don't be afraid to escalate or even terminate that relationship if it's necessary. Because if we can't fix the issue, prolonging that relationship is just going to beget more issues, right? So, vendor owner is not working with the vendor to get it remediated, go ahead and escalate it. The issue is not getting resolved by the vendor, even though they've promised to and have delivered a plan. We need to discuss termination and make sure we have a good exit plan. We need to report on these issues so that we are consistent and to set the expectation internally that people are looking at this and tracking it, including management and the board. Now, strong vendor issue management has lots of benefits, but some of them that are worth noting is that it can help increase the visibility to our overall risk profile and issues related to performance. It can also serve as a good trigger for that exit plan testing, like, hey, we've got a problem and they may or may not be able to fix it, but we need to know what we're going to do now. It also can be an opportunity to negotiate better pricing or other contract terms due to poor performance or other issues, right? Don't forget that this can give you leverage. Tracking issues really means improved reporting to the board, committees, and examiners and auditors. And the ability to terminate a vendor relationship due to a breach of contract can be evidenced by strong issue management. And then, of course, when we manage these issues and we look at them, we learn lessons. We learn lessons about maybe new and emerging risks. We learn about our own processes. It's a great learning exercise. Now, one of the best steps you can take in issue management is to prevent them from happening in the first place. And that can occur by starting in the earliest stages of that vendor relationship and engagement and start setting those expectations, right? We want the vendor to know what we expect and what we're going to do if issues pop up. That really strong due diligence can really help us identify potential issues down the road. So we want to make sure that that process is really robust. And we want to make sure that we have great contracts that spell out service level agreements and any penalties. We also want to have any KPIs or KRIs that we're tracking in there so they know what is expected and that we are paying attention to it. And then we also always need to make sure that contract has a right to audit clause so that when an issue comes up, we have the full legal ability to ask them for documented remediation and other evidence of improved controls. Of course, monitoring is key, right? We want to make sure that we're having those formal risk and performance reviews so that we can spot little problems before they become issues. And we need to take any new or emerging risk or performance issue seriously, right? Do not wait for something to become a bigger problem before you deal with it. And then don't forget to leverage those subject matter experts to review and approve your remediations. When an issue pops up, make sure you increase your monitoring until that issue is remediated. If you're doing it quarterly, do it monthly or weekly, just to stay on top of that vendor and the problem. And make sure vendor owners are accountable. They have got to do the majority of the work, and you'll need to escalate if they aren't. Another thing is you can really develop good relationships with your vendors and those vendor employees who are important to the products and services, and someone you can reach out to really help solve the problem.
The third poll question of the day is, at my organization, vendor owners are held accountable for remediating vendor issues. Yes, sometimes, no, or not sure. Hillary, let's go ahead and answer another question from the audience.
All right.
And this question is, who is responsible for issues that have not been resolved, the line of business or the vendor risk management team?
It's a great question and very timely with our poll. So basically, let's always remember sort of the lines of responsibility or accountability. So your business owner, your vendor owner, that line of business, they are the first line. They own all the risk. So if an issue is not being remediated and there's risk, they're on the hook. But the third-party risk management team falls into that second line, which is really about that oversight role. And they should be actively working with that first line to make sure that things are getting resolved. And they do that through things like, documenting the issue, reporting it, and practicing escalation. So ultimately, it belongs to the vendor owner, but the third-party risk management team has a clear role in making sure that the issue gets remediated. So I hope that helps.
Thanks, Hillary. Just a reminder, if you have any issues submitting the poll answer, please shoot us a message via the Ask Question widget, and we'll be happy to assist. Also, remember to receive the CPE credit for this session. You must answer all poll questions that appear on your screen and be in attendance for the entire live session. We will be closing out in just about 5 seconds. Thanks so much. Here are those results. Thank you, everyone, for answering this question. By the way, back in the related content widget, we've provided our 5 pitfalls of vendor risk interactive game and quick guide. This resource provides a fun game to play and an ebook to reference to help ensure your program is set up to protect your organization and customers from vendor risk. Hillary, I'll pass it back to you.
All right, so we've covered a lot in a very short time. I would advise you to download the deck if you want to go back and read everything, but let's wrap up with some key takeaways. First of all, we need to develop that process that can be implemented consistently, right? And that can be approved upon when necessary. We need to make sure that everyone is trained and they know what to look for. What does an issue look like? We need to update the policy and program documents to ensure that everyone knows we take issues very seriously and we want people to follow this process. We need to include those issues as part of regular reporting and go back and look at them and use lessons learned to improve your third-party risk management program. We also always want to refer to historical issues before we renew a contract, add additional business, etc. We also want to try and avoid those issues in the first place, so let's set really good expectations with vendors very early in the relationship before we even start negotiating the contract. We always have to address open issues with urgency because we don't want things to get worse and we don't want to have to escalate it. We keep following up throughout the process, and we do this before the due date, so don't wait until something is past due to pick up the phone and ask someone what's going on. Your management and your board need to know about open issues with high risk and critical vendors, full stop. And if everything else fails and these issues persist, you've got to review that exit strategy to make sure that if you need to terminate that relationship, you'll have a smooth transition. All right, thank you everyone for your time and attention today. I'm going to turn it back over to Jessie for some more information and some Q&A. Jessie?
Great, thanks so much, Hillary. Before we dive into more questions and answers, I would like to thank everyone for attending. I would also like to thank Hillary for her time in sharing some important information. On your screen now, you will see our upcoming webinars. On December 5th, our Regulatory Riddle or Common Sense, Decoding Third-Party Risk Regulatory Perspectives, Themes, and Expectations webinar. And on December 12th, our Third-Party Risk Management Best Practices for 2024 webinar. We hope you'll be able to join us for those sessions. A link to register for those is in your copy of today's presentation slides. Let's now go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in during the session. Okay, Hillary, our next question is, what should vendor owners' role be in the risk assessment process led by FRM?
Okay, I'm not familiar with the FRM acronym. It might be specific to an organization, but I do have to say that the vendor owners should be the ones completing that initial inherent risk assessment. Remember, your inherent risk assessment is that internal questionnaire where you're asking basic questions about the product or service, like, will the vendor need access to data or interact with our clients? It is always best to have the vendor owner complete that because in theory, they know the most about that product or service that they want to bring in. So they're absolutely responsible for that initial risk assessment. And then throughout the lifetime, they can also be identifying and assessing risks as they come up as they're related to performance or other issues. I hope that's helpful.
Great, thanks, Hillary. Next question. When discussing issues and risk, should you have a separate risk assessment for each vendor?
Yeah, so what I recommend and what is the best practice is for every product and service provided by a vendor that you have a separate inherent risk assessment. So if the vendor is delivering multiple products and services for each one, that vendor owner should complete that inherent risk assessment. And the reason for that is that not everything carries the same risk. And if we just say, well, they've already filled out a risk assessment, they're good to go, they may bring on another product or service, maybe one that requires the use of data that wasn't like the other one. We've missed that opportunity to really do our due diligence. So yes, you do need a separate inherent risk assessment for every product and service, and those risk assessments will trigger what due diligence and vendor risk reviews you need to do regarding that relationship. I hope that helps.
Great. Next question. Did you say that the remediation approval cannot be the vendor owner, and why is that?
So this is really important, and this is a great question. So this goes to sort of the principle of separation of duty. So let's say I'm a vendor owner, and I have a vendor, and, they've been not really consistent. Maybe their performance was up and down, and now they've had a bigger issue. Maybe they had like a shutdown during business hours. Well, part of that, issue management is about me as a vendor owner, right? So just like those vendor owners can vary, and we don't want somebody who maybe hasn't been doing the best job managing that vendor or hasn't really stayed on top of the remediation to be, the person who says, yeah, it's been fixed. We have to have kind of an independent view on that because at the end of the day, it's a trust but verify situation, right? Thank you, vendor owner. You say this issue's resolved. Let's look at the evidence. Let's make sure all the, boxes are checked and everything, looks good before we say it's okay. And that's really the reason that we don't want individual vendor owners
checking off that everything's been remediated. We do need an external set of eyes that's a little more unbiased and that can also hold people accountable. So that's why. I hope that helps.
Great. Our next question here. We have always had problems with our vendors turning in due diligence documentation late or not at all. Do we have to formally record that on our issues log?
So this is a really interesting question because what you are bringing up is not uncommon. So I think one of the ways to determine is how clear were the expectations around submitting that documentation. For example, when you submit the request, do you give them a hard and fast due date and somebody reach out to you if they're having problems or instructions what to do if they cannot meet that? So if the answer is yes, I think it's an issue because right off the bat, the vendor hasn't responded or reacted in a way that is, reasonable, right? We gave you a deadline, you didn't meet it. Whether it's for tuning in your due diligence documents or fixing a problem, we need our vendors to be reliable. So yes, when it comes to not doing the due diligence at all, there are, on occasion, companies that just sort of refuse. I know we've tackled this a lot in some of our other due diligence webinars, but, some of these major companies, whether it's like a national bank or a Google or whatnot, they just have too many clients. It's not practical for them or possible to really respond to each due diligence requirement. So many of them will offer up, different types of documentation and policies on their websites. So I think you need to be a little judicious when you decide if that's an issue or not. Now, if it's somebody who's previously provided you something and now they won't, then yeah, it's an issue. But you definitely need to tease that one out because it may be something that's not that uncommon or it would be typical for that type of vendor. Therefore, if you open the issue, it's not really going to be that easy to remediate. So I don't ever want you to not open issues because they're going to be tough to remediate, but I do want you to think about, what's the end goal here? If we can fix it, let's fix it. If we can't, then we need to think about something else. So that's my answer.
Great. Next question. Do we have to include issue management in our third-party risk management policy?
Yes, I do think that mentioning issue management is essential because, one, for most regulated industries, there is an expectation that you are actively managing issues. So putting it in your policy helps formalize that and sort of, creates that foundation. But it's also important because your policy is sort of your North Star for your program, and it's communicating all the rules and requirements to your stakeholders. So if you don't have it in there, and then you're asking people to manage issues or they get in trouble for not managing issues, it's kind of like, well, you didn't really tell us. So the policy is really meant to communicate all of the must-have requirements, and issue management is definitely one of them.
Great. I think we have time for one more quick question. Do we have to report any issue involving a critical vendor to the board, or only those that have not been resolved on time?
Nope. Any issue with a critical vendor should always be reported to the board. We do not wait for that, remediation to be in jeopardy or to be late before we tell them. And one of the reasons for that is that the board is supposed to be able to help the management drive the company forward. If there's a problem and it's already snowballed into a huge mess before they got brought in, it's going to be hard for them to do their job, ask the right questions, advise management, and help create, what the outcomes and solutions should be. So anytime an issue arises with a critical vendor, report it from day one, and then follow up with reporting about it through remediation. That way, if you get into trouble or it's, coming down to the wire, they're not caught unaware.
Great. Thanks, Hillary. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for questions today. Thank you, Hillary, for taking the time to address some of those that came in. Any questions we did not have time to answer today, we will address offline. We would like to thank you all for attending and hope you found today's session valuable. A big thank you to Hillary for her time and great content. You can ask even more questions inside of our third-party think tank, an online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and free to join. Just because today's session has ended doesn't mean the conversations and questions must. Post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. In the community, you'll find thousands of free educational resources, including ones related to issue management to assist you. If you'd like to become a member of Third Party Think Tank, you can register online or shoot us an email and we'll get you registered and send you a link to set your password. We did record today's session and that recording link will be provided to you in a follow-up email that you will receive tomorrow afternoon. Also in that follow-up email will be the survey link for you to request the CPE credit. On behalf of EdMinder, it has been a pleasure. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.